All right, guys, we'll get the show on the road. Thank you for being here tonight. I'm going to pass around your sign-in sheet. If you don't mind, if you give us your name, phone number, email. If you want to be on our newsletter, you can just kind of maybe circle your name. I don't have a section for it here, but we have a newsletter, and we have to get permission to send you the email. We can't send you the email without your written permission. That would be spamming you, violating all kind of like ethical Facebook type codes or whatever you want to call it. Didn't know that, did you? Now you do. You don't learn anything else tonight. You know how that works. Thank you for being here. My name is Rich Jones. I'm the CEO here at Favor Greenville. And just so everyone's in the right place, this is our family recovery group. So if you're here and you're a person in recovery, you're more than welcome to be here. It's very important, though. I don't want to turn this into a recovery group. So sometimes we have people in recovery and they're in the room, they'll kind of like take the room hostage and they want to tell their lead and they want to talk about their recovery experience, and that's not what this is about. It's about family recovery, what it's like to be on that side of the coin. So if you do that, if you're in recovery and you start monologuing, I'm going to stop you. Don't hate. Don't get mad at me. It just is what it is. We really want to be able to take time for family members to get an awareness of what's going on, ask some questions, me give you some information, and maybe walk out of here with some tools or some techniques or some, at the very least, a philosophy or a way of looking at this that might help you kind of through some of these difficult times dealing with a family member. My background real quick, so I'm a therapist. I've worked in clinical settings for most of my career, for about 12 years. And I've been here at Favor Greenville this is my 5th year. And I'm also a person in long-term recovery. For me, the issue was I have an opioid use disorder and also an alcohol use disorder. And so I have kind of like the theoretical background, but also in a Favor Greenville, we emphasize this even more, kind of like the lived experience. And then I've also dealt with this in my family in multiple ways, parent to child, child to parent, that kind of thing. So I also know what it's like to worry and be powerless over a situation and kind of watch a person sort of self-destruct and wonder, what can I do about this? And realize I can't do anything about it. I know what it's like to have somebody who's supposed to love you, who's supposed to care about you, treat you in bad ways because directly related to substance use. In my case, it was growing up at home. It was a war zone. And I never understood what that was all about till much, much later. I wish I would have had some information. I wish I would have known what was going on. I didn't. This is in like the 1980s, 1990s. Anybody remember the 1980s and 1990s? Rubik's Cubes, Atari systems, that kind of stuff. You know, there was this weird thing that we used to do in the 1990s, or the 1980s, 70s, 80s. It was this weird thing where it was like, kids would do this weird thing. They would go outside and play. Very strange. So, but it was also a highly stigmatized issue. This was the era of like, just say no. And everybody was going to jail for crack cocaine and that kind of thing. And, you were a bad person if you had an alcohol issue. You were a bad person if you had a drug issue. And so I never said anything to anybody. I never knew anything at all on what I was dealing with. I don't know that life would have been different or I would have been different if I had known, but I'm of the opinion knowledge is power, information is important, so that's kind of what we want to do tonight. And I'm going to stop at different points, but if you have questions or if there's a topic that you want to make sure we talk about, raise your hand, let's get it out there. I have an agenda tonight, but we don't have to stick firmly to that. If you have other topics and other questions that come up, just go ahead and shout them out. So the first thing we want to talk about is wrapping our mind around what are we dealing with. And I think this is, we talk about this a lot in here, but it's important. There's a lot of new faces here, so you have to start with wondering. We use the word addict. We throw around the word addict or alcoholic way too much. We label everybody with that label. We paint with a broad brush and we treat everybody the same. And here's what we have to understand is that this takes on many different forms. And I'm going to talk tonight about what it's like to be addicted. You guys get that? But I'm not sitting here saying that your loved one is addicted because I don't know your loved one. You're going to have to make some of these determinations. You're going to have to think this through. Really, the person themselves would have to be involved in that conversation. What this graph, though, guys, demonstrates is that there are a heck of a lot of people using at a risky level. 31, almost 32% of the nation, at any given time, they're going at it pretty hard. You guys know what I mean? Like, these are the college campuses. This is any given night. You guys read that the World Health Organization came out with a study. Any amount of alcohol consumption is considered dangerous now. So I'm sure everybody's going to stop drinking, right? So people, I mean, in America, it's part of the culture. You go out, what do? On a Friday night, you go out and get hammered. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily an alcoholic. That doesn't mean you've crossed that line into a substance use disorder. That doesn't. Now, it's hard to say that there's such a thing as recreational heroin use. Would you agree with me on that part? So, depending on the substance, you might be able to make a more direct judgment on what's going on. I'm going to be talking about this percentage right here tonight. This is very important. When I talk about the brain and what happens to the brain and judgment and impaired judgment and irrationality and bad decision making and an inability to control your use, I'm talking about this group. Now, at Favor Greenville, we don't do diagnosis, so when a person comes in, we're just going to sort of treat you with kindness, treat you with respect, try to get you to talk about what you want to have be different about your substance use, how you want to manage that in your life or get it out of your life. So we don't distinguish between the two, but I want to make sure we understand. I'm talking about somebody who's crossed that line into kind of like a neurobiological brain disorder, for lack of a better term. And I've been doing this long enough to suspect that everybody in this room, if you're here, it's probably because the person has approached this level. Because that's usually what pushes a person to come to a group like this. Because coming to a group like this is difficult, right? Because you don't know who you're going to see here at this group. Even though if you saw them here, they would be at this group. Therefore, they would be experiencing the same issue as you. But I don't want to go there because I'm going to run into somebody who I might know. Yeah? And they're thinking the same thing, so just come and ruin their day. That's a joke, guys. So we're probably dealing with this tonight. And so let's talk a little bit about that and what happens. And it's interesting, there's a little bit of controversy. People will argue over this. Is it actually, a brain disease that involves the neurotransmitter dopamine? Is it a learning disorder? That's something you'll hear people talk about. You'll hear people talk about, is it trauma related? Is it 100% trauma related? In other words, it's a coping skill. How about can we all agree to this? Something happens in the brain that, regardless of what you want to call it, however you want to label that, something happens in the brain that becomes different and processes these chemicals different and leads to these different type of behaviors. So it's more, can we all agree that it's more than just a decision for some of us? We cross this line into compulsive use. We cross this line into preoccupation. We cross this line into use despite clear consequences, those type of things. And so rather than trying to dive too far down into details, what we have going on here is this is the neurotransmitter dopamine, and basically what happens is over time is it's depleted. Now this isn't really, you won't get argument about this. This does happen. People do agree that this does happen. So if the neurotransmitter dopamine goes away, and it goes away over time because you're flooding your brain with an inordinate amount of dopamine. And dopamine is the pleasure neurotransmitter. So anytime you do anything pleasurable, if you eat food when you're hungry, dopamine is released. If you drink water when you're thirsty, dopamine is released. If you have a good conversation with your kids, dopamine is released. If you have a good experience with people in a small group, dopamine is released. So it's a good thing. It tells the brain, do that again. What happens over time, if you keep putting these chemicals in your body and you flood your brain with dopamine, the brain will shut off the production of dopamine. And that's what's happened on the left, on your left. This is the production of dopamine shut off. And so what happens when a person is in that state of mind is they resort to this compulsive seeking of the substance. They're trying to fix that. You'll hear people talk about, I stopped using, it was no longer fun, I was using to try to be normal. Now, do you guys, any questions about that part of the formula? Because I'm going to jump into a couple other things, but any questions about that part of the brain process? We do not have, good.
Oh, what's the time frame? Like, is that 20 years of...
That's a great question. Her question was, how long does it take to get like that? What's the time frame? And there's no definitive answer to that. It's very different for different people. It matters what the substance is. It matters how old you were when you first started. There's just some of the parts of any disease or any disorder, it's unpredictable. You can say that here are the risk factors and this is how we think it's going to go, but it's not exact. Now, I will tell you, it doesn't happen the first time you use. It's not like that. It's usually a repetitive process. The younger you are, the number one indicator is how young you were when you started. If you talk to people in treatment or you talk to people in recovery, and how old were you when you started messing around with substances regularly, not whenever you just did something. How old were you when you started messing around on a semi-regular basis? Most people will tell you 14, 15, that kind of range. In my career, I can tell you, I can count on one hand the number of times I've actually met with somebody, done a counseling session or a coaching session with somebody where they actually waited till they were 21. And it's all about brain development. If your brain is not developed, then it's more likely that this is going to happen.
Can that be reversed?
The question is, will that be reversed? And absolutely, you get better from this. So now, this is not how things are working for me. I remember being in that state, whatever you want to call that seeking state or that misery state or that inability to feel okay and just trying to get something to put into my body and be all right. I remember what that was like. And in my case, I think like 60, 90 days after I got into recovery, I started to feel substantially different. I felt like my brain was coming back online. The fog was lifting. Maybe the lights weren't on completely, but they were definitely flickering. And I think that there's different things that you can do to make it come back online quicker. If you're doing recovery programs, if you're exercising, if you're going to a therapist, those type of things stimulate the brain. You can tend to recover quicker. The younger you are, the quicker you recover. That's interesting because people talk about, one of the hard things today, we have a lot of young people entering into recovery, but the truth is the younger you are, the quicker your brain will come back. That's the way it is for anything, right? And when you're young, you can go to play basketball all day. You can go treat yourself like crap and get up and you'll be fine the next day. That's the same thing. You recover quicker if you're younger.
May I have
Go ahead.
prefrontal lobe development in a middle school kid or early high school kid? It hasn't happened yet. Now, if a kid starts working with or starts messing around with drugs at that age, are you saying that still develops, that it heals itself and it?
Oh, you mean after they get into recovery?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this thing that you'll hear people say, and it's a myth. It's kind of like a slogan or an idea or a concept that's really not true at all. You'll hear people say, I stopped emotionally developing at the age I started abusing substances, or I started misusing substances. My growth was stunted. That's not the case at all. That's not how this works. So you come back online, it's not a permanent condition by any means, not at all. And again, back to this idea of how old you are when you first started. That's what gets you. That's the most important part of this equation. Even more important than hereditary factors. We know that it does run in families, but the age of first use. So if we could do anything, it's one of those deals where the federal government has gotten the law correct with this age 21. Wait till you're 21 to start drinking. Because your brain is developed, you're going to process this differently. Did you have a question?
Yes. I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but I'm going to say it. Is that where Suboxone and Methadone come in?
So I was going to talk about that next.
Okay.
And it's sort of related to the brain, but I was going to talk about. I want to make sure I camp out here long enough for you to understand the psychological process, the craving process, the idea that if you're walking around and you got an empty bucket, you're looking for anything you can get to put in that bucket. And you're going to look for it, regardless of whether or not there's consequences associated with it. So that's the first thing. Let's just call that, for sake of argument, the psychological part of the process. Second thing would be the physiological part of the process, and that's not all substances, but let's take opioids, for example. So opioids, you also develop a physical dependence upon those. And that's where medication-assisted treatment, things like Suboxone and Methadone, they can become very, very useful in that regard because they're going to mitigate the withdrawal symptoms. They're also going to help with some of the psychological cravings because Suboxone is buprenorphine, which is a partial agonist. So it doesn't affect you fully the way Oxycontin would. Methadone is a full agonist, but it's a longer release, so it's safer. So when you're doing that, you're less likely to seek. You follow that? You're less likely to seek. It gets criticized in different areas. I will tell you, at Favor Greenville, our official position on medication-assisted treatment is we love you. We want you to come in. You're in recovery if you say you're in recovery. There's no qualifier. No one gets to say to another person, your recovery is legit, my recovery is not. That kind of thing. So now we believe that if a person is on medication-assisted treatment, they're going to do better. This is my personal take. They're going to do better if they're also working on some kind of counseling program or some kind of psychosocial part of their program. But this is real important. You got to remember, so there's two things. You got the psychological part and you got the physical part. We talked about opioids. You also have physical dependence with alcohol, for example. Alcohol, if you come off, is actually more dangerous than if you come off of opioids. You can go into seizures. You have physical dependence if you take benzodiazepines. You have physical dependence, believe it or not, if you smoke marijuana. Now, I didn't want to say that out loud in case there were anyone. I don't want to turn this into the great marijuana debate. All right, but there is some indications that there is a withdrawal syndrome with marijuana. It's interesting when you talk about methamphetamine and amphetamines. It gets a little bit dicey. I think that there's a withdrawal syndrome. I feel like I've witnessed that in people, but the medical world and the insurance companies don't think that there's a withdrawal syndrome because you can't really do anything. You just sort of sleep it off. So you got the psychological and you got the physical thing when you're dealing with addiction. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just real quick, what are the long-term ramifications of staying on a agonist like a methadone or Suboxone for a prolonged period of time, as far as then don't you have to come down off those and withdraw off those?
You don't have to come down, no. There's a sort of like an idea that you automatically have to wean off if you're on something like that. That's not true. Some people do. Some people, you'll hear more with methadone than you do with Suboxone. There's sort of an idea that if you're on it too long, the dose will continue. You got to remember, you continue to build a tolerance. So how high up can you go? And so you'll see people probably that's looked upon not really favorably. But you got to remember, it's doing its job, and so a person who's taking insulin for diabetes, sometimes they can get off of insulin too, right? How do you get off of insulin? You eat right, you do these other things. So it would be the same idea. Great question, though. So you got the psychological stuff, you got the physical stuff. It's more than just a decision. The symptoms, not that you want to get into diagnosing your loved one. Actually, you should do that tonight when you go home. That would be kind of fun. Consequences despite clear consequences despite use. Continue to use despite clear consequences. Tolerance, it takes more and more of the substance to get the same effect. Withdrawal, we just talked about. Craving, you think about it all the time. This is the one you won't know whether this is going on. This is a big deal, though. In my opinion, this is the hallmark symptom. I'm thinking about it all day is what separates me. It's what separates this from this. You know, these people, they're going to go at it hard if it's there, but they're not necessarily going to think about it all day. So that's craving, preoccupation, inability to cut down. You just can't. You say you're only going to drink on the weekends. You can't stick to that. Inability to control. You say you're going to drink 3 or 4 beers. You drink 33 beers. Physical danger. You know, you're doing things, putting yourself in danger while you're using. Great deal of time spent. Work and school problems. You don't get life taken care of. Social activities only involve using, and interpersonal problems. People are mad at you for that. If you meet 6 or more of those criteria in any given year with a pattern, you would technically meet criteria for what's called substance use disorder severe. The word addiction doesn't appear in the medical literature. So addiction is not actually a diagnosis. Do you guys get that? You can't actually be diagnosed with addiction. You would be diagnosed with whatever the drug is, use disorder severe. So for me, it would be opioid use disorder severe, alcohol use disorder severe. And that's as close as kind of like we can get to an x-ray. This is part of the problem, right? Because a lot of folks don't want to necessarily recognize that they have this going on. They can look at these symptoms, they don't want to cop to it, they don't want to say it, especially if they're younger, that kind of thing. You know, so they sort of like push that away. We have a term for that. The world has a term for that, denial. Has anybody heard the term? That's not me. Ah, man, it's really not interpersonal problems. It's just she's just being mean. That kind of thing. Yes.
Question: why is it that someone can, I guess, lack for a better term, go clean for a period of time, a substantial period of time, 6 months, a year, and then that craving still seems to be there, and they relapse? And I understand you and others do believe that, relapse is going to happen, and we got to work from there, keep working it. But why does it happen if they can go so long without it?
I think it's human nature. Why would a person who has heart disease, do what they need to do for 6 months and then be slamming a Big Mac on the way home from this meeting tonight? Human beings screw up. Even when it's not in our best interest. How many people in here have ever done the wrong thing even though they knew what the right thing to do was? And that doesn't even involve a heavy-duty substance. You follow me? What I'm saying to you tongue-in-cheek is that's just a habit or something. But now mix in a heavy-duty chemical and you start to get to some of the process. People relapse, guys, because human beings make mistakes. That's why they relapse, because we do things against our own best interest in all kinds of areas of our life. In all kinds of areas of our life. You name it. Exercise, diet, infidelity, what else? Gambling, shopping, just not taking care of how I treat my kids, how I treat my wife. I don't want to do that anymore, but I did it again. I don't want to do that anymore, but I did it again. The problem with substances is what? It's all, how do we want to say this? The stakes are higher. Would that be a way of saying it? It's more pronounced. It turns into something really ugly kind of quick. So whereas if I don't go to the gym tomorrow, I'm on a good streak, I'm trying to lead this different life. If I don't go to the gym, nothing really that bad happens. Just sort of is what it is. If I screw up on my diet, nothing really that bad happens. But if I'm sober, or if I'm not using for 6 months and I go out and I get a prescription of Oxycontin and I start backing on pain pills, there's all kinds of consequences associated with that, probably. I'm probably going to be, it's not just going to be a lapse, what's it going to be? Probably sooner or later I'm going to be seeking these substances. So I think that's why it gets more pronounced. Now, the answer to how do you protect yourself against that? If the stakes are high, if you agree that you have this condition, this is actually a really good question, because what it can do is, if the person agrees they have this condition, so let's say that I say, yes, I have an opioid use disorder, and the stakes are high, I could die, I could lose my family, whatever that may be, then I want to do everything I can do to protect myself from that. And that's where you can get into the argument that you don't have to relapse. The relapse is not necessary because you can take steps to protect yourself from that. What would those steps be? Don't be hanging out with people who use would be an example of one of those steps. Going to your therapy appointments would be an example of one of those steps. Taking your medication if you have a co-occurring psychiatric issue would be one of those steps. Going to recovery meetings would be an example of one of those steps. You do these things to protect yourself from that slip because you see it as urgent. Now it makes you wonder what is going on with the person? Do you think the person doesn't see it as urgent? And perhaps they're taking a cavalier attitude toward it. You guys get where I'm coming from? Because I know for me, early on, and this is something you can ask yourself about your loved one. You know them much better than I do. And really, they would have to kind of wrestle with this. But I know for me, I really thought that I had this condition. When I heard this, and this was presented to me, I was like, yep, that's definitely, I'm definitely dealing with that. And if I use, I'm going to go back and it's going to be bad. Do you get where I'm coming from? I always had that in my mind. So every time I didn't want to go to see a therapist, or every time I didn't want to go to an NA meeting, or I didn't want to go, talk to my sponsor, I had that motivation in my mind where I thought all hell's going to break loose if you don't get this right. I think maybe some people don't see themselves that way. Would you guys agree with that? Some people they might see themselves as addicted, but then I think these thoughts start to creep in where I can do this and no one will know. That's a common thing. No one will know. That kind of deal. So it might go back to trying to get people educated on, like, do you really think this is you, or do you not think this is you? Such a fundamental question. It goes back to this chart. Like, if you think you are just a risky user, in other words, you've gotten out of control a little bit, you've gotten yourself in some trouble, you had a, like my brother says to me, Rich, you only had we had one bad night. Because he doesn't necessarily think that I should be hanging up the cleats just yet. Right? He thinks I should be, doing a couple more laps yet. Yeah. So, did I have one bad night? Did I have one bad night, which would put me here? Or did I cross that line into something else? Do you see how they're two completely different conversations? If I think that I have one bad night, then I'm very likely to go out, on any given night and say, like, yeah, this is cool. I can do this. If I think I crossed that line, it still doesn't mean I'm going to get it right. It still doesn't guarantee anything, but it makes it more likely that I'm going to have the motivation to go do these things. Guys, doing a lot of recovery-related things and some of the stuff that goes along with it, and just, making some of those decisions. I was talking to a person the other day, and they were, it's a college student, man, and he's like trying to not drink at college, okay? That's not an easy thing to do. So in order for this person to not do that, he's going to have tremendous motivation and a tremendous kind of idea in his mind to get him through that process. Any questions or comments on that idea or thoughts? Yes?
I was gonna say, once, at least for our son, once that trigger, that switch is flipped, and they've actually dabbled in it, like gone to the doctor and got a prescription because they thought they needed something for pain, for tooth work. Once that switch is flipped, it's very hard to bring them around psychologically. So what do you?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. So you can recognize something in your son. So you can look at something in your son or your spouse. This doesn't even have to be, parents to kids. This could also be spouses. You can recognize something in him that happens that he may not recognize in himself. So the question becomes, how do you get the person to recognize that? How do you get them to get a plan together to evaluate that? It's probably going to be very hard for you as a family member to get them to do that. Why would it be tough for a family member? It would be tough for a family member because all the emotions involved. It's hard to have an objective conversation. They're going to write you off because you're mom. You're just over the top anyway. You're making too much of this. So it would probably be an outside source that would have to get the person to see that. It would probably be a process that the person goes through. Let me give you what I mean by that. It's not uncommon for something like this to go down, and this was sort of like the pattern in my life, where I would do certain substances, they would get out of control, and then I'd say, I'm not going to do those, I'm just going to do these, and then they would get out of control, and then I'd ultimately lead back to this situation where I was only going to drink on the weekends, and then that would get, I sort of had like all these trial and errors that eventually I felt like the jury came in and said, like, hey, we got a verdict on this dude. I know we've been like we've been in a hung jury here for a while, but we're pretty sure what's going on here. And so that process can be sped up if they're talking to people through it. You guys get that part? And maybe that's a family member. Perhaps that could be a family member, it could be a spouse, it could be a friend. You got to watch that though, because there's a lot of water under the bridge. If you're too close to the situation, you're going to have difficulty having an objective conversation. I'm telling you, because I've lived through this myself. I cannot have these type of conversations with people that are family. I just can't have an objective kind of like exchange of information. Because what do you want to do? You want to have them leaving the conversation actually thinking about what you said. What's likely to happen? It's going to turn into a screaming match. And then what? Everybody's going to leave angry. So the answer to that question is it's hard. I'm going to talk about boundaries as we go through this. A lot of people would say what you do with that is you start to like look for ways that you can set boundaries and nudge the person towards speaking to somebody or starting to work on their recovery, because you're not going to actually get them to figure that out. Would anybody else want to weigh in on that? Do they have any experience? Does anybody know the magic words to get their loved one to do the right thing? She needs to know. And she came here tonight with a guarantee that it was going to happen. I mean, I wish it was like that. And again, I would emphasize, so if there's some principles, because I think that's a very good question. The principles would be to you want the person to look at their behavior in a more objective way, and you want them to evaluate it more clearly, and it's not likely that they're going to do that with you.
Would it be better to set that up ahead of time or have them set it up with their recovery coach? Contingency plan, if this happens, then this is what I will seek help.
So these are really good questions, and this gets into some of the stuff where how involved do you be? How involved are you going to be in this process? Okay, so I've been doing this for a lot of years. Yes.
I know this is a possible suggestion. Now, I have a husband that I can't do anything with. Spouses to me seem to be harder. I don't know about everybody else's situation. But with my daughter, who is in recovery, has been over a year, over 10 years of trying. Finally, my two aunts, because my two parents are dead, my two aunts and I got together after she left a mental hospital in Travelers Rest, or was getting ready to leave a mental hospital. And we said, you cannot come home. You will go to a homeless shelter. We don't care that you're clean. We do care that you're clean, but we're not going to, this is not the answer to come home. Before we even got together with my daughter and told her that, me and my two aunts had an agreement. So we all three had an agreement to be on the same page, and it didn't matter how bad she bent that page, we stood by it. Now, I'm not saying I have no idea what he's going to say or suggest. That helped me in that particular situation. All the family got together. It's hard to do that, though. It's hard to get family to get together on every issue.
So, and I'm going to talk specifically about that. You have some options as you move forward, as you roll through the process. Now, it depends on what you're doing. If you're doing something like that, you don't have to put a lot. You don't have to get the ducks in a row, because you're really just saying, here's your choice. You're going to go. That's typically like you're going to go to a program, or you're not going to be able to live here. It's one of those things. Where it gets a little more interesting or a little more difficult is whenever the person is doing okay, they're sort of living at your house, and you're trying to figure out how involved you should be or how involved you shouldn't be. So, should I tell the recovery coach what's going on? Should I call the recovery coach? Should I set this up ahead of time? The answer to those questions are all no. No. Did a lot of work, worked with a lot of adolescent males. I ran an inpatient program, and parents will become over-involved, guys. And what will happen is it'll become counterproductive. It'll become counterproductive unintentionally. Because what's going to go on is that the person is going to start to see the coach or the therapist as what? An ally to the parents or an ally to the spouse. And it's not, for me, it's not about confidentiality. We respect confidentiality, but we can get around confidentiality. I'm not worried about that. What I get concerned about is that there's going to be a break in the therapeutic relationship, because now you're working for mom and dad. And I've had clients say that to me. And in the back of my mind, I thought, you're right. I am working for mom and dad. Because what? I was receiving all this information. And so I learned the hard way on that. Now, what can go on is if the person openly knows that there's going to be communication between the coach or the therapist. It doesn't even have to be a therapist, coach. It could be a therapist. It could be a sponsor. Like if it's like, hey, I'm talking to your coach, and the person says, okay, whatever, I don't care. I think that's a different scenario. But you got to be really, really careful about trying to move those chess pieces, because what's going to happen is you're going to get the opposite of what you want to have go on. Does that make sense to everybody? Because you will be compelled to do that. You will feel, you will want to do that, and because you have information that the person doesn't have, and you're not sure whether they're going to share that or not. You're not sure whether they're going to, so you're going to want to tell them that, and you're going to want suggestions and stuff like that. Get your son or daughter or husband or wife to be on board with you in doing something like that, then exchange the information. How do you get them on board? This goes back to some of the boundaries. I'm going to talk about, you talked about interventions. You didn't use that word, but that you were talking about an intervention. Intervention is one type of boundary, one type of response. I'm going to talk about some others as we go through. But super questions, guys, and these are the things that you got to get sorted out in your head. And here's the other thing. You are not going to do it perfectly, right? You are not going to do this perfectly. You are going to leave here, you're sitting there in your chair right now saying, I'm not going to get overly involved anymore. And then you're going to leave here tonight, and before you get out the door, you're going to shoot some text to the coach. And that's okay, man. That's okay. It's just like the person it's just like me in early recovery when I screwed up. So what? You try to do it. You try to do the best you can with it. You got to give yourself a break whenever you don't do it right. There's no parent on the face of the earth. Well, parenting is not like this exact science anyway, but there's nobody, parent, spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend, that walks through this stuff making good decisions. You got to remember, we're talking about irrational thinking for the person who is dealing with the addiction. As a loved one, you're going to go through that too, because there's fear going on, and there's anxiety going on, and there's all these thoughts, and so you're not going to make 100% rational decisions either. So cut yourself a break. Just maybe be working on it. That's all you want to do. Be aware of it and work on it. Yes?
From my personal experience, early on in my daughter's situation, she went to see a counselor, and I was told that I could tell him
Yes.
anything, so I wrote in a letter, wrote it to him, he read it to my daughter.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it was kind of.
Yeah, you'd have to, you have to have, that has to be controlled, it has to be done in a certain way, that kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Well, it's just the agreement we have with our daughter who's getting one-on-one counseling is there are certain topics that occasionally she will invite us in on the discussion with her counselor.
Yeah,
And that seems to work because then she knows she can tell the whole story to the counselor.
so the other part of it is, unless you know for sure that the person is not sharing the information, let's just take, for example, maybe the person is messing around, dabbling with some substances, and you feel like they're not being honest with their coach or their counselor. The other thing I would say is don't assume that they're not being honest. Because a lot of times, especially in today's world where we're starting to approach things differently, as a coach, we don't come down on a person when they tell us that. Like, if you actually saw the way that we approach people who are seeking recovery, some of you, I guarantee you would walk out and you'd say, what was that? I do not want my son or daughter coming to Rich anymore. I want him going to somebody who's going to extract a pound of flesh. Do you get that? Because there's a punishing side to drug and alcohol counseling. What you see in the movies and what you would hear and what you hear in a lot of other places is a very confrontational, in-your-face, you screwed up approach that Faber Greenville will never adopt. And so, you would, but the opposite of that is a lot of times they actually let us know what's going on. Does that make sense? I'm not going to tell you, if you're my therapist, I am not going to tell you what's going on if you're going to chastise me afterward about how I just screwed up, and don't you know you're going to die, and here, let's get you back to square one here. We're going to set you back here. We're sending you back to the re-education program. And then the next week I come in and he says, how was the week, Rich? It was wonderful. I went to 73 AA meetings. I didn't even think about substances at all. Well, there was one time when I was like watching TV and a beer commercial came on, and I threw my PlayStation through the TV. That's how committed I am to not using it. That was over the top. Sorry. All right, but do you guys get that? That's important, especially if you are sending your loved one here to Faber Greenville. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent with that, but people don't really understand what we stand for here, and they get a real bad idea on what we're doing. We're not promoting use. We don't tell people it's okay to smoke marijuana. We don't tell people it's okay to mess up. We simply love you back into the room. That's all we want. We want you to keep coming back, and there's actually a technique and a style to that that's been proven to be much more effective than get your act together. Listen, the people who come to our groups, guys, they've already been told don't do drugs. They know they shouldn't be doing drugs. Do you know what I mean? They're like, oh, Rich, I never thought of that. Go home and tell my mom and dad real quick, Rich just told me not to do drugs. So, yeah, exactly. So, all right, so now you start saying how, if that's the case, how do I get them in with somebody? And again, it doesn't have to be about Favorite Greenville. It could also be a therapist. For that matter, it could be a 12-step recovery room. It could be, how do you get them in and start this conversation? In some cases, it could be very serious, and it's like, I need to get them into rehab. And it all comes down to, whether it's an intervention or you're just starting this process, it all comes down to boundaries. And so boundaries, you start to think about what's the best way to approach these situations. And we'll get into some specifics, but let's start with how you think of boundaries. You got to be careful, because a lot of times people will think of a boundary as something that's put in place to control another person. I'm going to tell you what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do in my house, and you're going to follow these rules, and these are the consequences if you don't. That is not a boundary. That's a rule that is followed up with consequences, and you may or may not want to do that, but that's not what I'm talking about tonight. A boundary is about how you want to be treated and what's okay with you, and what are you going to put in place to make sure that you can live an okay life, that you can have a certain quality of life. Boundaries are about defining how you want to be treated, not about controlling another person's behavior. We used to, in this adolescent program where I really got exposed to family therapy was when I was working with adolescent boys in a drug and alcohol program in Pennsylvania. And we would fall into the consequence trap all the time. I don't know if anybody ever had their loved one in a rehab when they were a teenager, but when you have your loved one in a rehab as a teenager, they're sent home with a contract. Anybody know what a contract is? You might even know that for your adults. Like, a contract is like the Magna Carta. It's like the Constitution. This is all the stuff you will do, okay? And then we hired a consultant to come in and take a look at that and basically said, you're setting the kid up for failure. You used to have a list of 25 things. He's going to do one of these things wrong, and since it's written down by the drug and alcohol counselor, what's going to happen? It's going to become this big deal. So he didn't make his bed. He did not make his bed. That'll go from like he didn't make his bed to like he's going to relapse because it's on the contract. So you don't want to think of it like that. You want to think about communicating on how you want to be treated. What is okay for you? And so you're setting personal boundaries, and this is to your point, ma'am. You were just talking about this. There's personal boundaries. How do you want to be treated? And then there are team boundaries. I'm using the word team. When you were talking about your aunt, your two aunts, you were talking about a team. A team can be her situation where it was her two aunts and her. It could be two parents could be on a team. It could be, a spouse, boyfriend, girlfriend kind of situation, and maybe a friend. The team can be defined in a lot of different ways. It's people who are important to the person. So you got personal boundaries and you got team boundaries. Can your personal boundaries be different from team boundaries? This is an interesting question. Probably in some ways. There may be certain things. I'll give you an example. You'll see this a lot. Let's say you got mom and dad and you got the kid, and the kid is self-destructing. So there'll be team boundaries around something like, you can no longer be in our house if you're going to continue to use these substances. You just simply can't live here. And they're on the same team in that regard. But what will happen is the kid will leave, and mom will be so upset whenever she talks to the kid that she'll say, I cannot talk to you. My boundary is for my own emotional health, I'm going to have to disconnect. Whereas dad is able to talk to him and talk about the weather. Do you guys get this? So you can there are certain things where you're going to have have to be on the same page with, but then you can have different types of relationships and different boundaries in that regard. You do not have to do that part of the equation the same way. Any questions about that? Because I think that's important. People get a little bit overwhelmed in their mind when they think that being on the same page means you agree on every single thing about this issue. That's not what this means. It means there's probably 2 or 3 major things that you're going to have to agree on. But you're probably going to have different styles and different ways of approaching it in terms of everyday conversations. You're probably going to have different styles and different ways of approaching it in terms of, hey, I'm going to go meet so-and-so for lunch. Whereas another person, I can't do that because if I go do that, I'm going to leave so upset. And if you go back to this point, guys, if it's about defining how you want to be treated, if you're going to leave an interaction so upset that you can't sleep, you want to set a boundary on that, on how you want to be treated. Does that make sense? And then identifying who needs to be involved in the conversation. I'm going to go through that a little bit, and we can talk about who do we actually have to get in on this? How are we going to make an impact with this person? And we've been trying ourselves. I've been talking to them all day. I've been talking to them all day, and nothing's happening. Who else needs to be involved? And so you have different types of boundaries, different ways that you can influence the person, different categories, if you will. Some of the most obvious are like financial things, right? Those are the things that usually pop out to people. Are they living at your house rent-free and spending all their money on drugs? That kind of thing. Are you paying for the car while they're drinking and driving? Are you paying the rent at their apartment? Are you paying for the phone? Are you paying for college? All these things connected to, you're not comfortable with their behavior, yet you're unintentionally supporting it through these actions. This is pretty obvious stuff here. A lot of people will be looking at that. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be on the same page with that, but a lot of people will look at that. What's a little bit less obvious is the emotional boundaries, or the emotional influence you also have over the person. You can influence a person who you have no financial control over by setting boundaries around what's okay for you to observe and what's okay in terms of your interactions. It's incredibly difficult to do. This is big time among spouses. Emotional stuff is how my wife got me to change. She had no financial control over me, right? Nothing like that. But it was about how was she going to act toward me when I was using these substances. It's a little different parent to child. Let's just talk about spouses for a minute. So you got the husband is out of control, or the wife is out of control, whatever it may be. But she or he wants you to treat them just like business as usual. Everything is okay. I'm not high today. I'm not drunk today. Let's go out to eat. You get where I'm coming from? That's where the emotional boundaries would come in. And it would be like, I'm not going to act like everything's okay. And you can get into that. And sometimes you have to sit down and talk to somebody, but you can get into that and say, like, okay, how do we repair this? How do we get back to business as usual? I don't know, maybe you go a week and we don't have another one of these episodes. Maybe you go 2 weeks. Maybe you get involved in some type of programming. But you're saying to the person, I'm not okay with this. I'm just simply not going to act like it's okay. It's really interesting. You'll see with people whenever they're deep in, guys, when they're deep in to substance use, they'll be looking for people that they love to validate them and tell them that they're okay. They'll want you, even if it's not about money, they'll want you to kind of like say everything's all right, you're all right. I don't know if you've ever felt that way, or if you've ever had that experience where you almost feel like they're badgering you. Have you ever you try to disengage and they don't want you to disengage because what? They want you to tell them. They want you to okay their behavior because in the back of their mind, what's going on? They know it's not okay. So this is where you can also start to seek boundaries. Now, if in a spouse situation, when my wife told me I was no longer permitted to reside in the same domicile as her, okay? You like that? All right. So when she said I couldn't live there anymore, was she setting a financial boundary or an emotional boundary? Maybe a little bit of both. Maybe because it had to do with a living arrangement. And I used to say, then I went and lived in my car. That's what I used to say, like when I would be like, early recovery. Then I went and lived in my car. Then I went and spent about 6 hours in my car. That's really how that went down, and I came back begging, right? So there's a financial aspect to that because you're kind of losing the place. But I would argue that it's even more of an emotional boundary that's being set at that point, because the thing that got me wasn't I didn't have a place to live. The thing that got me was, am I really going to be out of my kid's life? And at that time, see, my wife doesn't have Facebook, so I can get away with saying a lot of this. At that time, I wasn't even sure what was going to happen with her and I. It wasn't even really about that. It was about the emotional boundaries around my children. And it's strange with all the other things that were going on in my life, the car accidents, the threat of losing a job, the physical consequences that were going on with me. That issue was the one that was the tipping point. And you'll hear people talk about you have to be at bottom. I was actually like on the way up when that happened. You guys follow me? Like, that was not by far the lowest period of time in my life when I finally made that decision. So it's not about that. What happens with boundaries, now again, I want to go back. We're going to emphasize the boundaries are for you. But what sometimes happens as you set boundaries, you also will move the person towards some kind of recovery process. Because as you start to change, they start to change. Remember, if you believe like a family, any family or a couple, it's a system. It's a series of interactions. It's a series of roles that you fall into. You can probably look at your situation with your loved one, and you can think that there's a script that gets played out. There's a script and how it goes down. I still remember our script. You know, it blows up. I suck it up. I lay low for a little bit. I gauge things. I have these little feelers I throw out. I throw these little hooks out. Like, yeah, man, it'd be nice to get a six-pack. If she reacts negatively, I quickly say to myself, not now. Be patient. And I go on and on and on until what? Yeah, cool, let's go ahead, get a six-pack. And then boom, the cycle goes over again. I'm not saying it's just like that, but if you look, you probably get into similar. Sometimes the cycle is much more dramatic or much more drawn out. It's the person goes to rehab, comes out, relapses. Goes to rehab, comes out, uses again, that kind of thing. So you're looking to try to break that, and boundaries is a way to do that. Does anybody have any questions about the difference between financial and emotional boundaries, or any other examples, or anything else you would want to share? Yes?
When you were talking, and it refers to this, but you were talking about the team, who's on the team. What if your daughter or son has a spouse?
Yeah,
who's not on the team?
Yeah, this is where you can't. It's a great question. The question was, what if there's a significant other that's not on the team? You're gonna have a lot of trouble getting anything done.
Thank you.
You're gonna have a lot of trouble getting anything done. If you look at this, and I'm sorry, you can't really see this, but like this circle in the middle, let's pretend that's the person, that's your loved one who's using. You know, you have to get the people closest to them involved. Now, let's say that you have that they have a spouse, but you have 4 other people that might be able to overcome that. You know, maybe there's a sister that the person's really close to, or maybe there's a coworker. You'd have to really work hard to overcome the fact that the person who's closest, especially if they're living with them, especially if that's where they're kind of getting their financial support from and their emotional support, ask yourself, well, I guess a better answer to that question would be, if they're close, if they are close and they live together and they're connected, then you got to have them involved. If they don't have anything going on, if they're spouses but they really don't have anything going on, then you don't. Does that make sense? So it depends on how close the spouse is. Do you guys get that? If they're close and they communicate a lot, they're tight, that kind of thing, and that will happen, right? That dynamic will happen. You will have a situation. Now, what if it's the opposite? Is it possible that a person could be married or in a relationship, but the person closest right here is actually a parent, specifically a mom, if it's a dude? Could that happen?
Absolutely.
That happened to me. That was my scenario. And what I mean by that was where I would get my emotional validation, and the Richie, everything's going to be fine speeches would be from my mom, right? So, and she was not on the same page. And it wasn't until she started to get on the same page that I started to think a little bit differently. And my wife was able to start to make some of these changes. You guys get that? So whoever's occupying this spot, you sort of have to try to figure out a way to get them involved. How do you get a person involved if they need to be? Chris?
I was gonna ask a question. Say you're not sure if the mother is close or not. Is it like a amount of time spent with them? Or how can you make that determination?
I think that's a great question. So, you could be asking yourself, how significant is this? You know, is mom really, really involved? I think time spent, how much they talk, a lot of that kind of stuff. Have you guys heard the term enmeshed? So, with an adult relationship, you can kind of get a feel for that if you feel like the person is too enmeshed with a parent. It's not a quantifiable thing where you can say like if they talk every day, but it'll be, I think you would feel it, especially like if you were kind of in the room with them, that kind of deal. And when in doubt, you probably have to get that person on board. Do you guys get that? So like if you don't know for sure that they're not distant, you probably want to get them on board. Because you got to remember, if you go back to the brain, and you're getting logical about this, if you go back to the addicted person's brain, and what do we know? They're irrational. They're looking for reasons to not have to change. Can we agree on that? They're looking for reasons to not have to confront this. They don't want to have the uncomfortable conversation. They don't want to be put on the spot. They would love to just, let's just sort of not talk about this. So, they're gonna push this situation around, and they're gonna, I hate the word manipulate, but I can't think of a better word. They're gonna manipulate the situation. So you may have to just make the best call you can. Now, how do you get a person involved if they don't want to be involved? This is another one of these magic answers we want you guys to come away with. Yes?
I remember a few months ago being here, and my husband and I were a little upset over the extended family where we were not on the same page. We have an addict, one of our addicts, who does not want to attend any meetings or rehab or anything. And I would say both his brother and his mother, the stepmother, were enmeshed. We can stand back a little bit and see a little of that, but we were thinking, oh my, we have to do something with the extended family to just be on the same page. You had said, be patient.
Yeah.
Stay back, let them
Deal with it.
connect with the addict in their way. Well, it happened.
Yeah.
It happened, and
That's a great point.
it was a rather very chaotic. Our addict, after totaling his brother's car, and then his brother going up north to take him bodily down here, and then he used in his house
Yeah.
with his daughter there, with his brother's daughter.
A few minutes
And
before
he
our
had-
job interview.
Yeah.
He then said, who was so kind, but he said, you have to leave.
Yeah.
You have to leave. So he wanted a car. He had nothing. He has no money, no car, no nothing. But he's all dressed up because he went to an interview. So there he is walking. We don't know where he is. Now, the extended family are calling us, and we are sharing everything that you ever
Yeah.
said to us with them, so that they will have at least the information to help.
I think that's a great point.
As it turned out, he walks 6 miles to his mother's house.
Oh, wow.
So now he's there, but we don't have any control.
So if you're in a situation where you're not on the same page, you can do things where you start to try to pull back from the situation, and you start to not be a problem solver in any kind of way. In other words, you say, if you think this is okay, the ball's in your court. Figure it out. Figure it out, Mom. You think Rich's behavior's all right? Figure it out. He's your problem. Go figure it out.
But Rich, they all were on this phone call. Everyone could hear one another, and they were saying, "You're right, Fanny. We were all enabling." Now we have his brother very aware because he had a few epithets thrown at him from his brother as he was leaving, and I'm not sure whether the mom is on the same page. Now it's really a family.
It becomes that way based on people's experience. People start to get their own information and say, well, I've been burned now too. And it tends to, so this is obviously simplistic, but what you get whenever you're struggling with people being on the same page is what? You got two ends of the spectrum. Kick the bum out, let's that end of the spectrum, and then what's the other? Oh, come on, it was just the family silverware, no big deal. Never liked that anyway. Right? So you got two ends of the spectrum. Two ends of the spectrum, and so the idea would be you start to work on that, you start to try to come together, you start to talk about that. This is very, very common though. You'll see this a lot where you get, and it doesn't have to be always parents. It definitely breaks out like that a lot of times with parents, but it could also be like, maybe the spouse is really, kind of like wants to do something about it, but the mom is saying you shouldn't do that, give them a break, that kind of stuff. So it breaks down like that. The other thing with the boundaries, you got to be real clear on what it is that you want. What exactly are you looking for from the person before you start to have the conversation? Is it you're going to have to go to rehab. You got to do something about this. You got to go somewhere and get better. I can't deal with this anymore. Is that the behavior that needs to change? Is it that they just can't use at your house? Is it that they're, as long as they're living with you, they have to be doing some type of recovery program? Do you get where I'm coming? You have to be really, really clear, and you're going to have to communicate that to the person. Remember, mean what you say what you mean, but don't say it mean. Be very, very clear on what you want. Like, you can't assume if I walk in and say, hey, Rich, you got to be in recovery if you're going to be here, that the person knows what that even means. So you kind of, and this goes back to the team, right? You get the team together. What do we want from this person? Okay, we're going to go in. Now, again, your example, very clear. We're going to go in. We're going to talk to her. She's either going to go to rehab or she's not coming home. So she has a fundamental choice. Maybe in other cases it would be, maybe they're not quite severe. So you're saying, like, if you're going to continue to live here, you're going to have to do 12-step meetings and continue to see your therapist. Or maybe the person's doing all that, and the issue is that you're coming in at 4 o'clock in the morning and you're keeping me up all night. That's also a boundary that you can talk about. But when you present it to the person, and you're going to say that this is just semantics and this is just splitting hairs, Rich, but I'm telling you, it makes a difference. Instead of saying, if you're living here, you have to be in by 4 o'clock, or you have to be in by 1 o'clock, say, I can't sleep until you're in, so in order for me to be okay, you got to be in by 1 o'clock. Again, you're going back. Remember, people don't want to be controlled, right? Especially people who have an addiction issue. Like, that's the last thing that we want to be told. So you're trying to say, like, this is about me. This is about us. We can no longer have you live here because you're using. We love you too much to watch you self-destruct. So here's your choices. You can go. We know that there's this place. We actually know they have a bed. Make the call right now and you can go. If not, then I'm sorry. We're going to have to drop you off at the Salvation Army. I love you, but we're going to have to do that. But what and talk about yourself when you're talking about the boundary. You guys get that? If you talk about yourself, the person may not be okay with it, but it's harder to argue with that because it's not about, they can't look at you and say, you can't tell me what to do, you shouldn't be telling me what to do, I'm your husband, I'm your wife, I'm your kid. It's not about that at all. It's just about me. I'm self-destructing. I can't watch this anymore. I can't sleep at night. Or it also gets into that financial stuff where the person is just taking advantage of you. The person is just living there. Or maybe, and you may have gone through this, perhaps they're destroying property or stealing property. That kind of thing. So you really start to think about, what am I not okay with? And then clearly, what is it that I want you to change? Now, what is the target behavior? You guys, I don't think it's fair for me to sit here and tell you what the target behavior is. I don't think it's fair for me to sit here and say that if so-and-so's using, he can't live at your house. Or if so-and-so's using, they have to go to rehab tomorrow. I think you have to talk about the target behavior with the team. And the way that I was taught to do interventions, the model was that you're going to try to sell the car for, $40,000, but if you can only get $25,000, you're going to take it. So if I'm going into the conversation, and this isn't always the case, but if I'm going into the conversation and I want them to go to rehab, but all they'll agree to do is an intensive outpatient program and meetings, I take it. I take it. Now, that's easier for me to say than it is for you guys to say because I'm not living with the person. Do you guys get that?
Doesn't that conflict with mean what you say?
No, because when I walk out of there, the mean what you say is whatever I say when I walk out of that conversation, I'm following through on. But I can.
What you're going in with, what you're coming
When
out
I'm coming out with. Yep. And it's a philosophical kind of a deal where what we would say is that any kind of recovery is better than no recovery. Now, you got to understand that there are limits to that. What are the limits? How the person's treating you is a big part of it. No one in this room deserves to be treated badly. Nobody in this room deserves to be cussed out. Nobody in this room deserves to be threatened. Nobody in this room deserves to have their stuff stolen. You get that? Like, if that's what's going on, then it's no negotiation. So you got to look at the details of the situation. And again, talk it over ahead of time and sort of be on the same team and kind of get that. when I went through some stuff with my daughter, I think I might have shared this with you, but when I went through some stuff and we were going down, and it was more on the mental health end, and she's doing really well now, thank God. But there was a conversation that had to occur with the facility and the therapist and us, right? And it was a contract conversation, right? So I didn't want to be Mr. Professional dude going in there. I just wanted to be dad, all right? So I didn't go in there saying we're not going to do a contract. I just went in there and followed the rules, all right? But here's what I said. I said, as soon as we sat down, I'm not kicking my daughter out no matter what. Let's just get that out on the table. I'm not kicking her out. So I'm not even going to entertain that idea. Do you follow me? And I'm going to put it right out here right now. And I think that was helpful, guys. I think that was helpful because I didn't have to play hard ass. Do you guys get that? Because I this mean what you say what you mean, but don't say it mean. You can call me a sexist or whatever, but I remember when my son went to the University of Pittsburgh and went temporarily insane, I dropped him off at a bus station. It was like 9 degrees in Pennsylvania, and he was taking a Greyhound bus to Philadelphia to see his girlfriend, right? And I dropped him off with nothing and drove away, and I looked in the rearview mirror, and he was the happiest person in the world. And I went home, and I slept with no issues whatsoever. But when this idea of it being my daughter, it ain't happening. That's me being real honest with myself, and that's me. I'm going to do this how Rich can do it, not how the textbook says I should do it. Do you guys get that? Because playing around with it and acting like you can be something when you can't it's not going to get it done. All you're going to do is just sort of cycle through. And if I tell you, like, here are the rules, and then I can't stick to the rules, what does that tell the person? You're pushed over, there are no rules, it really doesn't matter. You're better off setting one boundary than you are setting 5 that you can't follow through on. So find the target, think it through, talk it through with people you trust. Maybe you have a coach, maybe you bring it up here when we're doing our open share, maybe you have a therapist, or maybe you have a friend who's been through this, or somebody in another group that you can talk to. Get some feedback, find out what's reasonable, what's not reasonable.
So in your daughter's situation, just as an example, if she had continued to do whatever she was doing and continued to create the chaos, where would you go with the next step?
So I think that could have. Here's the other thing. Great question. So what if it doesn't work out? Will that conversation be different a year from now? It absolutely could be. Do you get that? Like, everybody has a breaking point. Do you get where I'm coming from? Everybody has a breaking point. And I'm not telling you that you don't kick a chick out. You got me? Kick a chick out. Kick a chick out. I like that. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm so glad you said this. I am not making a rule around whether or not. What I'm saying is be true to yourself. Know what you can do and what you can't do. There are many people who could set that boundary. There are many people who could say that. What I'm telling you, my experience as a professional doing this and doing for a lot of years I did family therapy too. And so I saw this all the time. Parents, they would parent not on what they wanted to do, but on what they thought they should do. And so what they did was they tried to live up to this. I think I have a picture of it in here. They tried to live up to this false, see what's going on here? This false perfect parent idea that's out there. This is a Facebook post. All you see is the perfect baby with the mom, but around her it's a trap house. So, not what you should do, or not what you think you should do, or not what you think the book says, but what can you get yourself in touch with. Now, you might have to work on that, and you might have to start trying to make yourself do some things that you can't do. You might have to get out of your comfort zone. You might have to, because if this is going on and it's getting bad, you're going to get to the point where you need to make a move on this thing. But don't say it out loud. Don't make the move until you're sure you can make the move. That's what I meant by that. I don't believe there are hard and fast rules with this, guys. One of the interesting things about recovery or about families dealing with this is, we will think that this is what's going to work and this is what's going to get the person to kind of like do recovery, or this is what's going to get the family to do the intervention and stuff like that. And we have to remember that a lot of this I mean, a lot of this is unpredictable. People get better, and people get better in ways that we can't even understand or predict. And people don't get better the same way. I think this is a really important thing for us to talk about. My getting better, my recovery, Rich's recovery, which was what? Total abstinence, 12-step recovery, going and seeing a therapist, going back to school to become a clinician myself, winding up running the premier recovery community center in the nation. That version of recovery, that may not be getting better for Johnny. Getting better for Johnny, it might be incremental, and it might be, I'm kind of getting by, and I'm passing some classes, I'm doing all right. Yeah, I'm using less, things are getting better, that kind of deal. And, it may not wind up in total abstinence. There's not a destination to this thing, guys. What you want is, if I'm thinking, like, what do you want? You want the person moving forward in this process. If you can somehow think, like, how do you move forward? And sometimes moving forward requires rehab, right? And why would it require rehab? Because it's just too darn dangerous otherwise. And the person just can't get it. In today's world, with some of these substances that are around, this is the thing that is really different, guys. Like, this conversation would have been easier to have 10 years ago. But now you start to get into fentanyl, you start getting into carfentanil, and now a lot of times we'll do rehab, or we'll do something, or we'll do medication-assisted treatment just because we got to do something now because we're worried because of the danger. But you guys, it's not this one pathway, it's not this one thing. That's not what it all. At Favor Greenville, what we are, we believe we're a professional organization that's focused on, like, health and wellness. We want the person to get better. We also want you to get better. We also want you to be okay, because y'all are suffering too. You guys aren't sleeping at night. You're not concentrating at work. You got some things going on. So health and wellness for you too. All right. It's chaotic. It's turmoil. If you're not careful, when you're communicating with your team members, it can turn into World War III. Right? This is not an easy subject to talk about. When you're in a tough situation, like this thing that I went into with my son, with my 5-year-old son last week when I wasn't here. So I'm in a car in Greenville, South Carolina at 11 o'clock driving to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because I've essentially been told I don't know whether your son's going to make it or not, right? At least that's what I heard. Get up here now. He was having a major respiratory issue, and he was in Children's Hospital there. And so I'm driving up there, and my wife's calling, and I'm calling, and my wife's calling, and I'm calling, and it's just a matter of time until I say something stupid, right? There's no way that I'm going to negotiate that system or negotiate that situation calmly and rationally and under control. At one point in time, I'm going to say something, and it's going to be judgmental, or I'm going to say something, and it's going to be it's going to come off the wrong way. I'm not at my best. This is the same thing when you're dealing with addiction. You're not at your best when you're dealing with active addiction. If you got a team together, if you're husband and wife, if your aunts are part of your team, whatever it is, you got to give each other a break around this. So the stupid thing that I said, very noteworthy stupid thing that I said about, like, why did you wait so long to get them there? Terrible thing to say, right? Because I was playing armchair quarterback. Because there was another hospital. We went like 3 times to a local hospital before we went to Children's. You guys get the scenario? And so I said that. So as soon as it comes out of my mouth, I'm like, holy shit. like that is bad on all kinds of levels. So I just immediately, I'm still driving up. When I get there, I just immediately say, can I get a mulligan on that? Can I get that back? It was horrible, right? But the point of that is that I was not at all my best in any kind of way. Like I was scared to death. I was out of my mind. There was no way in the world that I was gonna. And that is what you guys go through. What I was going through that night, that level of urgency is what you guys go through when there's an incident, when the person goes back out, or you get a phone call from the police, or you get a phone call from the hospital, or they're out there using. It's the same level of fear, guys, that I'm going through. And so you have to know that you're not gonna communicate perfectly in those situations. So having, I don't call them rules or just principles, and when are you gonna talk about this? These are just, you can have your own ideas, but try to talk about it. Try to talk about the situation on a regular basis, not just whenever there's a crisis. Obvious reasons, right? Let's get a plan together. There's no winning, there's no losing. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. It doesn't matter. We don't have to do it Rich's way. We don't have to do it Melissa's way. We don't have to. It's not about that. Identify the target we talked about. Compromise. Be careful where you get outside info, and beware of toxic people. You do not. We talk about this a lot in here, but I think we got to wear this out. You need no one in your life who is going to tell you, if that was my kid, I would. And then they, whatever it is that they would do. Because here's what I know, and I've said this before, they would not do it. And I know they wouldn't do it because I've been in a room with them when they've explained to me why they wouldn't do it. Well, he's left-handed, and left-handed people, we know they can't make it on the streets of Greenville. Now, if we were in Chicago, he could handle it, but not in Greenville. So be careful of toxic people. Try to be kind to each other. The other basic stuff, put away your phone whenever you put your phone off to the side if you're trying to communicate on something. Tone of voice and body language. Sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it. How about, and avoid blaming, clearly, Rich. Listen to learn, not listen to respond. And what's the difference? The difference is if I'm listening to respond, when you're talking to me, I'm already formulating the answer in my mind. And I'm not really even listening to what you're saying. I'm not hearing you at all. Listen to learn is like, I really want to get your take on this. Elicit outside support, that would be us. Try to, even if the next step is we're just going to talk about this again on Wednesday because everything seems to be going okay. Or even if the next step is we're going to talk about it on Wednesday because there's nothing else we can do right now. Try to leave that conversation with the next step. Here's what we're going to try. Even if you feel like you're not going anywhere, and even if you feel like you're stuck. You guys get that? You're trying. And even if, maybe you don't even, maybe the next step is, we're not going to meet again next week. We've been dealing with this now for a year. I really don't know. There's not much we can do. We'll meet every other week. You get, like, your individual situations will have a lot to do with it. But you're just trying to think, how do we talk about this, and how do we get the rational part of this out there? Really every boundary is a version of no, right? No is a complete sentence. No, I won't lend you $1,000. No, I won't let you use in my house, that kind of thing. What gets in the way of saying no? A lot of times, and it's number one on this list, is fear. Fear. Fear of what? What's going to happen if I say no? Usually it's a scenario you kind of have in your mind. And that might be different for different people. If it's a child, it might be something like, he's going to run away and just go live with his friends, and we know what they're all about. If it's a spouse, it's like, he's going to go use, and he's not going to come back all weekend. Like the scenario, but it's this fear-based idea that if you set the boundary, something horrible is going to happen. Another thing that gets in the way of saying no, we plan on saying no in the moment, but we allow the person to bully us into saying yes. That's happened too, right? You go into the scenario, you're surely going to say that this is it, and what? There are different techniques that people use to accomplish this. Some people will try to use like the power of the word and kind of like manipulate you. Other people will just try to bully you and try to wear you down. So you had every intention. Now, some of the things that go on is your daily experiences or even past experiences will influence how you respond to these things. And this is a different example. This is for self-esteem and for depression, but it's this idea of our day-to-day experiences go through a filter that is based on our past experiences. And what are our past experiences that are very significant when you're dealing with addiction? Every other incident that's occurred. All the things that you've been told about addiction along the way. For that matter, in today's world, it's all the things you see on the news about addiction. It's the things that you've heard in this group. It's all the stuff. And so what happens is it goes through this filter that tends to put us into the worst case scenario. Tends to put us in a worst case scenario. So I had a situation right before I came up here, or right before I came in here, where we were talking about, you know, kind of a common thing, young, 22, that kind of deal. And, you know, the person was using a heavy-duty substance and had been doing okay for a while, but now was smoking weed. Okay, those were the facts that we knew. But the mom that I was talking to was 100% sure that the kid was doing Xanax. Okay, and I'm worried he's doing Xanax again, and I know he's gonna either need to get a rehab, or I know that there's also these. And I literally, all I said, I just literally said, how do you know that that's what he's doing? Like, I thought something had happened that she knew that she had found Xanax in his room, or he had tested positive for Xanax, or he had wrecked a car, you know, like nodding out or something. And she like kind of stopped, and she sort of said, I don't know that. Do you guys get this? She was telling me this like it was a fact. Not like I think he's using Xanax. It was like, it is a fact. He is using Xanax right now as we speak, and here's what's going to happen, and it is a fact. You don't know that, guys. You could be absolutely right, and you're sitting there right now and you're saying, like, I've been through it enough, Rich, to know when it, and so you could be right, but what I'm telling you is that if you don't have don't borrow worry. Does that make sense? You know, if it's in front of you and you see it and it's something to be worried about, then go ahead, jump all over it. But don't guarantee the outcome, the worst case scenario, until you see it. You know, now that doesn't mean you turn a blind eye to things. You'll see things that are going on, that kind of stuff. You'll become convinced over time. There will be evidence. I'm not encouraging you to turn away from like hard evidence, but you get where I'm coming from? People say, and people say that they can tell whether their loved one's using by the text message. Is that true? Holy cow. I would really want to do a study on that. Like, I would really honestly, like, if y'all can do that, I got to tell you something. You need to be working for like the NSA or the CIA or something like that. Like, we got to get you in. You got to start reading body language. We got to get you over. Like, you got to start working for America or something, man, because, you know, people have said that before, but what could you pick up in a text? Like, unless it was blatant, right? Like, if it was blatant, like.
It changes the way they converse.
Yeah.
It's a total change.
Well, okay, if it's blatant, I get it. But like,
Yeah, but if they usually use horrible language, or they usually use good language, and all of a sudden they're not. Or
okay,
blah, 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 blah.
Okay.
You can tell. You
all right,
can tell.
all right.
Tell by with my son, our son at least, is the lack of communication.
Oh,
Like,
okay.
days will go by and you won't get a text, or you'll get a sporadic text, or.
So if it goes, so it's the opposite. It's like actually not even the content. If it goes away.
Isolation.
Or I could tell if my son's girlfriend was responding to me instead of him. When he was with her, he wasn't doing well, but I could tell the way it was phrased and everything that she was responding instead of him.
Okay, I'm getting rid of this slide. Taking it off. It's no longer in this particular one. I was wrong. Jump to the conclusion, man. It sounds like you're pretty right. We're gonna get that out of the way right there. You know, other things real quick before we wrap it up for tonight. A couple other things that could get in the way of saying no. Basic stuff. You want the person to love you. You love the person. You hate the way it feels whenever there's conflict going on. You hate the way that feels, whether it's spouse or parent to child. And then the other one is just straight up guilt. You just feel guilty for the situation. You tell yourself stories, and, you know, I shouldn't really be saying no. I should be helping. I should be able to do more. You know, I write in here that I'm a big fan of number 3, that kind of thing. Now, we showed you this picture. You know, a couple things that you can do around the fear-based boundaries. You know, there's a technique in other areas called fear setting, and this doesn't really apply to addiction, but maybe you get in touch with the idea that the more you come to these type of groups, or the more you talk to people that have dealt with this, the more comfortable you start to become with the worst case scenario. Why is that? It's no longer quite the boogeyman that it was. Now, it's still incredibly uncomfortable. It's still there, especially with some of the worst case scenarios where you may go in your mind with like Literally, this could have the worst outcome ever. This could be an overdose, that kind of stuff. But it's this idea of, if you get it out there, you start talking about it, you kind of like look it in the eyes and say, we know it's there, we know it's there, that may start bringing down some of the fear. The fear will never go away, but the idea is, can you bring it from a 10 down to a 6? Could you bring it from a 10 down to a 7? Even that type of thing. For the person who bullies you or debates you into giving in, you got to do a hit and run with this person. You got to deliver the boundary and then leave. Like, you literally got to deliver it on the way to work. Okay? It's got to be like, hey, let's go let you know you're getting out of the house tonight. See ya. You know, set yourself up, set the environment up so that you're going to be able to like give this information, but you're not really going to give them a chance to debate. Now, I'm exaggerating it, obviously, but that would be the idea around it. You know, for the we want them to love us challenge, you know, this idea of suffering in silence and just sit in it, and it's okay for people who love you to be mad at you. It's okay for people who love you to just, you know, be upset, be angry at you, be sad. It's okay for a person that you love to be sad. You're going to have to get used to that. That's a feeling that you're going to have to get used to. I will tell you on a side note, those of us who grew up in an alcoholic home, if you grew up in an alcoholic home, this one will be particularly difficult for you. And the reason is that when you grow up in an alcoholic home, discord is not good. It's not safe. So everything being okay actually equals safety. Do you guys get that? Conflict in an alcoholic home is never just conflict. It's not about how you feel. It's all hell's going to break loose any moment now. Or I'm not going to see my mom for the next 6 weeks. Do you guys get that? So you're encoded with that. If you grew up in an alcoholic home, number 3, you're probably very, very vulnerable to. And I got to tell you, like, this is something. So, you know, I'm in recovery 18 years. I am a therapist. I know this. This is an area that I feel like I've made that much progress in 18 years. Because I grew up in that house. I lived through that. And it's still there. I'm still that little kid who wants to make everything okay, have everything be cool, because I don't want it to pop off anytime. And even though I'm aware of it, I still have so much trouble sitting in that moment. And a lot of people would say that number 3, and number 4 to a certain degree, but number 3 drives a lot of the classic codependent behaviors. Because, remember, classic codependent behaviors are, I'm okay when you're okay. That's the classic definition of codependency. So, yes?
I was going to say, as an ACOA, I find that sameness is safety. When there's significant change, as you would say, holy shit, what's going on? I go nuts.
Yeah,
sometimes.
yes.
What's going on? This must be it.
That's right. That's right. So, with guilt, the idea would be just to try to literally say the boundary, do what you got to do. You start to feel the guilt, so you want to back off. You make a rule for yourself that you're going to sit back, you're going to give yourself 5 minutes, and you're going to try to evaluate that on a rational level. Like, you're literally going to ask yourself the question of, you know, is this boundary, should I feel guilty about saying that I'm no longer going to pay the rent for my son who has flunked out of college and continues to use cocaine and doesn't have any, and what I'm telling you with guilt, if you do anything that even resembles a rational evaluation, you will not feel guilty. You will not feel guilty. The problem with guilt is we automatically act on it. Do you guys follow me? Like, the guilt almost works at a subconscious level on us, and so we correct it real quick. Oh, I'm sorry. So what I would say is, after you issue the boundary, step back for 5 minutes before make a rule. You're not going to say anything for 5 minutes, and you're going to sit down and you're going to reevaluate that. Okay? All right, guys. So it is 8 o'clock, and we're going to wrap it up for tonight. Next week we don't have group because it's Labor Day, right?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So it's Labor Day. We won't have this group. We'll be back in 2 weeks. I think I'll stick to the schedule and be doing another lecture in 2 weeks. I think that's how we want to do this, because what's going on is that this is also being pushed out to our other locations. It's being pushed out to Anderson and Spartanburg. So we want to try to stick to the schedule. And yes, ma'am.
Is there a way, do you take
It's on my personal Facebook page. So you go to Richard Jones, and I don't know how many, like, if you hit follow, then it'll come up, that kind of thing. That's where it's posted, and you can look at that. I also have a blog, guys, recoverycartel.com. You should go and you should check that out, and I have a family link, like a family page. I have all kinds of videos on there too. I have family group. I also have car rants, which are really fun, just short and car rants. So also, guys, I'll grab you some information at the end. We have some cards. If you need additional support, we have a hotline that can help you with that. Otherwise, thank you for being here. If we can get a moment of silence for those still suffering with this disease, and for the family members burning this no choice of their own, followed by the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. All right, that's a wrap.